It's a warm night in Akron, Ohio, in the summer of 1899, and a police officer named Louis Mueller Sr. is climbing into the driver's seat of something no American police officer has ever driven before. There are no horses. There's no whip. There's no smell of hay or sweat or manure. Just the quiet hum of two electric motors and the faint glow of headlamps cutting through the dark. Mueller pulls a lever. The wagon rolls forward silently, like a ghost. And somewhere nearby, a drunk man causing trouble at the corner of Main and Exchange Street is about to become the answer to a trivia question that people would still be asking more than a century later. Who was the first person ever arrested by a police car? That's the story everyone tells. A drunk man. A silent electric wagon. A moment in history. But here's what they don't tell you in the plaques, the museum placards, or the quick 2-minute YouTube explainers. This wagon wasn't just a curiosity. It was mocked. It was expensive beyond reason. It nearly bankrupted a small city's police budget. And just 1 year after it rolled onto the streets, an angry mob would try to destroy it completely, throwing it into a canal like it was garbage. So let's talk about what they really didn't tell you about the world's first police car. Let's talk about the money nobody wanted to spend, the design flaws nobody wanted to admit, the riot that almost ended the whole experiment, and the quiet, humiliating way this machine's story actually ended. Because the real history of the 1899 Akron wagon isn't a triumphant footnote. It's a messy, expensive, occasionally embarrassing experiment that just happened to change policing forever. Here's something the plaques don't mention. In 1899, $2,400 wasn't just a lot of money. It was an almost unthinkable amount for a city police department to spend on a single vehicle. Adjusted for today's money, that's somewhere around $65,000. And remember, this wasn't the 1960s or even the 1920s. This was an era when most American police departments were still relying on officers walking a beat, on horses, and on wagons that were, quite literally, pulled by animals. A horse-drawn patrol wagon cost a fraction of that price. And horses, unlike this new machine, didn't require anyone in city government to understand something as exotic as an electric battery system. The vehicle was built by the Collins Buggy Company, a local Akron manufacturer that had spent its entire history building horse-drawn carriages, not motorized vehicles. This was a company adapting on the fly, taking carriage-building skills, and trying to bolt an electric drivetrain onto them. The man responsible for the actual engineering was Frank Loomis, the city's mechanical engineer. Essentially a city employee being asked to design and greenlight cutting-edge experimental technology for a police force that had never operated anything more advanced than a bicycle. There was no blueprint to follow. No other American city had done this before. Akron wasn't copying anyone. They were guessing, and guessing with taxpayer money. And what did that money buy? 2 electric motors, each producing about 4 horsepower, powered by an onboard battery pack. On a good day, on flat ground, the wagon could hit somewhere between 16 and 18 miles per hour, and it could travel roughly 30 miles before the batteries needed recharging. Today that sounds almost comically limited. In 1899, next to a tired horse pulling a heavy wagon through mud and cobblestone, it was genuinely revolutionary. But revolutionary and reliable are 2 very different things, and Akron was about to learn that the hard way. The Akron wagon wasn't some sleek little runabout. This thing weighed close to 2.5 tons, roughly 5,000 pounds, and it was built with seating capacity for up to 12 prisoners at once. Picture that for a second. A silent, battery-powered machine, heavier than most modern pickup trucks, designed specifically to haul a dozen arrested men through the streets of a small Ohio city. It came equipped with electric headlights, which alone made it one of the more advanced vehicles in the entire country at the time, a gong that served as an early version of a siren, and a stretcher for injured officers or civilians. But here's what they don't dwell on. All that weight, all that capacity, came at a cost that went beyond dollars. A 2.5-ton electric vehicle with a top speed of 18 miles per hour and a 30-mile range wasn't built for chasing anyone. It wasn't fast. It wasn't agile. It was, in the most literal sense, a mobile holding cell, more useful for hauling people after the fact than for responding to anything happening in real time. Officers didn't use it to catch criminals in the act. They used it the way you'd use a delivery truck, to transport people who had already been subdued from one point to another. And that's exactly what happened on its very first assignment. Not a dramatic car chase. Not a daring rescue. The wagon's inaugural job was picking up a disorderly, intoxicated man causing a scene at Main and Exchange Streets. That's it. That's the birth of the American police car. Not a thrilling pursuit, but a drunk man being loaded into an electric wagon while curious Akron residents stood on the sidewalk, probably wondering if this strange new machine would even make it back to the station without breaking down. This is the part of the story that gets skipped entirely in most retellings. On August 22, 1900, just about a year after the wagon entered service, Akron erupted into a violent race riot. The unrest was severe enough that rioters set fire to the city's fire station and attacked the firefighters who tried to put the flames out. In the chaos, the mob turned on the police department's prized new machine. They seized the electric patrol wagon, the same one that had made headlines as a marvel of modern policing, and pushed it into the Ohio Canal. Think about the symbolism there for a moment. This wasn't random property destruction. Police vehicles represent authority, and in a moment of extreme public anger toward that authority, the crowd specifically targeted the one machine that embodied the department's modernization, its investment, its pride. The wagon that was supposed to represent Akron's forward-thinking leadership in law enforcement ended up submerged in canal water while a city burned around it. The wagon was pulled out of the canal the next day. It was cleaned up, repaired, and, remarkably, put back into service. There's something almost poetic about that. The very first police car in American history survived being drowned by an angry mob and kept working. But it also tells you something the celebratory version of this story leaves out. The relationship between this new technology and the public wasn't universally admiring. To some people, in a moment of crisis, it wasn't a marvel of innovation. It was a target. Here's the part of the story that really gets buried. This machine, the one that made history, the one that's celebrated on plaques and in museum displays as America's first police car, didn't go out in a blaze of glory. It didn't get retired with a ceremony. It didn't get preserved in a place of honor from the very beginning. The Akron wagon stayed in service for about 6 years after its debut. And then, in 1905, the city sold it for scrap. Not to a museum. Not to a collector. As scrap metal. For $25. Read that again. A vehicle the city had paid $2,400 for, roughly $65,000 in today's money, ended its working life sold off for the equivalent of pocket change, likely melted down or stripped for parts like any other worn-out piece of machinery. There was no fanfare, no recognition, at the time, that this thing had been the first of its kind in the entire country. It was simply old, expensive to maintain, and technologically outdated by 1905, when gasoline-powered vehicles were already starting to prove themselves faster, more flexible, and cheaper to run than anything battery-powered. And that's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this whole story. Akron wasn't rewarded for being first. The city took an enormous financial risk on unproven technology, endured public mockery and skepticism, watched a mob try to destroy their investment during a riot, and then, within a handful of years, quietly discarded the machine once something more practical came along. Being first didn't mean being remembered, at least not right away. For decades, this story sat mostly forgotten, a regional curiosity known mainly to Akron locals and police history enthusiasts, until historians and journalists slowly pieced it back together and gave it the recognition it has today. Meanwhile, other cities were watching, even if they weren't quite ready to follow yet. Frank Crowell, a police commissioner up in Detroit, right in the heart of what was becoming America's auto industry, took real interest in the idea of motorizing police forces. It would still take years for the concept to spread nationally. Motorized patrol vehicles didn't become common in most major American cities until around 1904 and beyond, and it wasn't until 1911 that police motorcycles became the dominant tool for fast response policing, arguably filling the exact gap that the heavy, slow Akron wagon could never fill. Akron's experiment was ahead of its time in the truest sense of that phrase. It arrived before the infrastructure, the public trust, or the technology had caught up enough to make it fully successful. So here's what we're really left with. A city that gambled an enormous sum of money on an unproven machine. A vehicle so heavy and slow it was closer to a mobile jail cell than a pursuit car. A mob that literally tried to sink it in a canal during one of the darkest nights in the city's history. And an ending so quiet and unglamorous that the machine was sold for scrap without anyone marking the occasion. And yet, despite every one of those setbacks, despite the cost, the mockery, the riot, the scrapyard ending, Akron's gamble worked. Not because the wagon itself was a masterpiece of engineering. It wasn't. It was slow, heavy, and limited by a battery that needed recharging every 30 miles. But because someone, somewhere in Akron's city government, was willing to spend money nobody wanted to spend on an idea nobody had tried before, and prove that it was possible for police departments to move away from horses entirely. Every patrol car cruising down every street in America today, every silent electric police cruiser rolling out in cities right now in 2026, traces its lineage back to that clunky, 2.5-ton electric wagon that got pushed into a canal by an angry crowd in 1900. That's the real story behind the world's first police car. Not a clean, triumphant invention story, but a messy, expensive, occasionally humiliating experiment that happened to work out in the long run, even when almost nothing about its short life suggested it would. Officer Louis Mueller Sr., the man who first drove it, could never have imagined that his quiet night shift picking up a drunk man at Main and Exchange Street would become the opening chapter of an entire industry. So if you've ever driven past a modern electric police cruiser and thought it looked futuristic, remember, we've actually come full circle. The very first police car in American history was electric too, more than 125 years before it became fashionable again. If you found this story as fascinating as I did digging into it, let me know in the comments. Did you know the first police car was electric before I told you? Do you think Akron gets enough credit for taking that risk? Drop your thoughts below, because stories like this deserve to be remembered properly, not just as a trivia answer, but as the messy, human history that it actually was. And if you want more deep dives like this one, stories the history books skip over, the compromises, the risks, and the almost forgotten moments that actually shaped the world we live in, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on. There's a lot more history hiding in plain sight, and I promise we'll keep digging until we find it. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important inventions in history don't start with triumph. They start with a drunk man, a silent electric wagon, and a city willing to take a very expensive risk.